Hello, my name is Barry Lank. I'm a reporter with the Eastsider, and I'm talking with Congressman Adam Schiff, who represents California's 28th district, including Echo Park, Silver Lake, and Los Feliz. Congressman Schiff is now in his 10th term in the House of Representatives, where he is currently chairman of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. And according to Wikipedia, he also writes screenplays. He does also represent Hollywood. Congressman Schiff, thank you for talking to us. How are you today?
I'm doing fine. How about yourself?
I'm busy, not as busy as I might be, but we're all inside from the rain. Let's jump into it. I think the first big issue we want to look at is the economy and how local businesses can come back financially from the quarantine. You've been talking recently about film production restarting, but I'd also like to expand the question to retail, with restaurants and bars in particular. A lot of these places may not be coming back. What can be done here?
Well, these businesses really need a lifeline right now. And there are a number of things that we're doing to try to help them get through this difficult time. This goes really for any type of small businesses. And it's what's called the PPP program, the Paycheck Protection Program, but also the Emergency Economic Disaster Relief Loans. Now, when we rolled out the program originally, there were problems with it. We had some of the larger banks, for example, favoring some of their larger, more lucrative customers. You had other institutions that were very large and very well-heeled participating in the program when they really shouldn't. We have tried to make programmatic changes so that it really goes to those that need it, the small businesses that need it right now. And in the HEROES Act that we just passed on Friday, we provide that 25% of the funds in the small business program would go to businesses with 10 or fewer employees. We also set aside about 60 billion of the funds for small and community-based lending institutions to make sure that those lending institutions that are really closest to some of the small business customers get resources and don't get shut out by some of the larger lending institutions. So these are some of the steps that we've taken to try to help. But we also made the program more flexible for restaurants and other businesses. We did so by extending the period of time in which they could make use of the program. It had been confined to an 8-week period. Now they can make use of the funds over 24 weeks, and they can decide which 24 weeks they want to use it for. Okay. There was also a requirement that 75% of the funding for the small business go to payroll. Well, that just didn't work for a lot of businesses where payroll were not that substantial a part of their costs. So we allow more flexibility in using it for rent and utilities as well as payroll. But Barry, I'll tell you, there was something that I was pushing for that would go well beyond this, which I'm still going to continue to push for. And that is a broader paycheck guarantee program along the lines of a bill I'm co-sponsoring that Pramila Jayapal has introduced. That follows the model in Britain, Germany, France, some of the Scandinavian countries, where the federal government would essentially guarantee payroll right now and guarantee paychecks until we get through this, say 80% of payroll. Whether you're a large, medium, or small business, you don't have to go through your bank. It will be done through Treasury, through the IRS. To me, it's much more efficient. It's more equitable. It doesn't let the banks pick winners and losers. It doesn't let the administration pick winners and losers. So I'm going to continue to push for that because we place such a reliance on unemployment compensation. That just seems to me not the right choice. We ought to try to keep people attached to their employment even if they can't go to work right now.
Do you see yourself making getting much leeway with the payroll protection program, given it sounds sort of antithetical to what the Republicans, try to talk about, at least. Are you seeing any Republicans who might be interested in working with that?
Interestingly, yes. In fact, one of the proposals in the Senate is a Senate Republican proposal. I think that would guarantee 80% of payroll. There's some that are more generous that would guarantee 90% of payroll. So it does have bipartisan support. We, in the HEROES Act, took an important step towards a payroll guarantee by a major expansion of the employee retention tax credit. But frankly, I think we need to go beyond tax credits to a broader proposal like Pramila Jayapal is offering, but also that Josh Harder in the Senate is offering.
We had, just on this issue of economics, a reader wrote in with a more immediate question regarding extending unemployment benefits. And I appreciate this may be a question for the state government rather than the federal, but the reader says, what is the latest on the 13-week extension for those who have exhausted their benefits? Will it include the $600 stimulus? I guess there's supposed to be $600 on top of the regular unemployment. I talked to people at the Unemployment Development Department who say it is coming, but they don't know when. The latest I read on their website was May 27th. Yikes. That is too long for many of us to wait. What is going on? Do you have any insight on that?
Well, I can certainly share the federal perspective, and the federal additional $600 benefit goes, I think, up until July. But that's clearly not going to be enough. And in the legislation we just passed on Friday in the House, we extend that until January of next year. I think that's really going to be necessary. In terms of when the state follows suit, EDD and the state legislature will be probably a better source of information on that. But I'll tell you, one thing that I've been working on too, that a great many of your viewers and readers will be interested in is, unemployment compensation wasn't going to cover a lot of the people that work in the industry. And indeed, a lot of people that work in other parts of the gig economy, freelancers, for example. And I was able to lead an effort in the House in the CARES Act, the earlier legislation, so that people that go from contract to contract, gig to gig, job to job would be covered, and they are. But there is a follow-on problem that we still need to fix, and that is people that have mixed income, where they have income from a W-2.
Yeah.
Well, you know the problem well, and they have income from a 1099. Folks that are in that category may still get either shut out or less economic assistance from unemployment than they really deserve. We should consider everyone's full wages, however they come, in whatever form. So I've been urging the Ways and Means Committee to make that a part of this HEROES package. The bill that we passed won't be the end of the story. I imagine they'll take something up in the Senate, and then we'll go to a conference committee, and I'm hoping in conference that we can solve this particular problem for people with mixed income.
Let's move on to the subject of misinformation. And of course, this has been a problem since long before COVID-19. You recently praised Facebook, actually, in this regard, and held it up as an example to Google, YouTube, and Twitter about dealing with misinformation. How is Congress addressing the problem, and how should the rest of us be dealing with it?
Well, and what I did, with respect to Facebook is I wrote to a number of the technology companies about the problem of misinformation. I've been in a constant dialogue with them also about the issue of foreign interference through their platforms in our elections. Facebook took an important step where they would not only take down misinformation, which the other tech companies are doing as well to one degree or another, but they would inform people when they had been exposed to misinformation. And that's a follow-on step that I think is very important. And so we're urging the other technology companies to follow Facebook's example there and let their viewers, their users, know when they've been exposed to bad information. Now, we can't tell the companies, what they can communicate or not communicate. We're not going to operate as censors, but we can urge them to use best practices, and that's what we're trying to do.
This is as far as the federal government can essentially go, is to talk to the companies and sort of by recommendation say, in effect, listen, can you guys help us out here to maybe straighten out the misinformation that's passing through? Is that about as far as the federal government can really take it?
There are other, sort of good behaviors that we can urge of the tech companies. The big hammer, frankly, that the federal government has is not being able to prescribe what they can say or not say. But right now, these companies have immunity from liability. And that was a statutory provision when they were nascent industries. And we didn't want to stifle innovation. Well, they're not so nascent anymore. They're behemoths now. And there have been a number of issues raised, mostly in the context of foreign abuse of their platforms, where people have raised, myself included, do they still deserve to have this form of immunity? Should they still have it, or should they be now forced, like other more entrenched industries, to face the same kind of liability if they don't observe best practices or community practices, or things that they propagate lead to harm? So that's the big club, but yes, we can't tell them what algorithms to use, or what they can tell or share, or what they can't. But we can encourage them. I encouraged Facebook, for example, to do what it could to help local journalism. And I'm thrilled. I talked to Mr. Zuckerberg about this, and had written to him about it. And he called me and said, as a matter of fact, here's what I'm prepared to do. And we're putting $100 million into local journalism. And so I'm glad, some of the great local journalistic endeavors like your own are able to receive support. And I've been urging that we support as a community our local press as well. They're so important right now.
Yeah, I caught you gave us a shout out on your press release when we did receive, full disclosure, we did receive a grant from Facebook, and it will certainly help. Moving on, let's talk about another federal issue that's very local, the post office. This one, we're going to come to take a question from a reader on this. Quote, can you verify if the Postal Service is at risk of dismantlement? I'm hearing that the Trump administration is withholding COVID-19 emergency funding to the institution and trying to take it over to privatize it, question mark. I'm concerned about this and the implications of it during the upcoming elections, where mail-in ballots will be a major source of voting tabulation, and that interference will once again occur in this election. I know it seems to me the funding of the post office, it advanced past that. Some things have developed since then, but can we talk about the unique pressures on the Postal Service right now?
Absolutely. And, I think the question is exactly right in terms of the risk of the Postal Service right now. We're obviously very reliant on the Postal Service now to get word from home, or from our elderly parents or grandparents, for medicines, for food deliveries, for other vital essentials. Our letter carriers are taking to our homes, and they're risking themselves when they do so. So our gratitude goes out to them. The Postal Service was already having financial difficulties before the pandemic, given the advent of email and how much e-commerce is going on now in terms of communication, separate and apart from deliveries. So they were already under financial pressure, but of course the pandemic has made that even more substantial, even while it's made their service even more important. But they are at risk. They're running a multi-billion dollar deficit. We put about $23 billion in the HEROES Act to help cover the Postal Service for the immediate future. But your reader is right. The Trump administration is very hostile to the Postal Service. And I think it's for three reasons. There's three kind of overlapping pernicious interests involved here. The first is privatization. Many in the president's orbit have always wanted to privatize the Postal Service, but interestingly, only part of the Postal Service. They want to cherry pick the urban and suburban routes, which the private sector could handle profitably, and they want to leave the unprofitable routes, the rural routes, on the shoulders of the Postal Service. Well, that would just further decimate the Postal Service. But privatization is one motive, so the profit motive is part of it. But the other motives include the president's persistent interest in punishing Jeff Bezos, who is the publisher of the Washington Post, as you know, but is also the CEO of Amazon. And the Amazon and the Postal Service have had a mutually beneficial relationship that has helped the financial fortunes of the Postal Service. But the president has, for a very long time, wanted to use the Postal Service as a cudgel against Amazon and raise postal rates on Amazon just to punish the Washington Post. And we learned a couple of years ago, the president was secretly meeting with the Postmaster General in an effort to browbeat the Postmaster into raising rates on Amazon. when they were not called for. So there's that motive of censorship of the press by punishing the Postal Service to punish Amazon, as self-centered and selfish as that would be to the people relying on the Postal Service. But perhaps now the paramount political objective for the president is to discourage absentee voting. It's been a business model for Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy for the last several years, as their agenda has become more and more unpopular, to predicate their continued political success on fewer people voting. They know that if more people vote, they cannot survive with that kind of unpopular agenda. And you heard the president enunciate this quite openly about 3 weeks ago, when he said that if more Americans could vote by absentee ballot or other ways, that no Republicans would ever get elected. Now, I don't think that's true, but if it is true, it's a good reason for them to change their divisive platform. It's not a good reason to disenfranchise voters. We don't want a repeat of Wisconsin, where people had to choose their health or their vote. So by crippling the Postal Service, they make it very difficult for states like California and others that are moving to an all postage paid election. And that's really what the country should be doing right now, is preparing, if necessary, during a pandemic, to mail every American a postage paid ballot. So that is part of the attack on the Postal Service, but it's also vital to the health of our democracy.
A part of the background with the Postal Service's problem, it seems to me they had the legislation passed in 2006 requiring them to fund the pensions for, I think, up to 75 years in the future. And I just learned, I didn't know this, that the House actually passed an attempt to rescind that. Is that moving forward? Did I read that correctly?
That's right. And that requirement, by the way, to pre-fund their retirement is a requirement that no other federal agency has. So this is, part of the reason why the Postal Service has been singled out for disparate treatment as a way of undermining the solvency of the Postal Service. And I just think it's a terrible disservice, not only to the customers of the Postal Service, but to the hundreds of thousands of people that work for the Postal Service. Many of them, a great many of them, are veterans. The Postal Service has been a great job opportunity for veterans, and they've been good middle-class jobs. So it's a double tragedy that they're making it this hard on the Postal Service when we are more reliant than ever on it, and we have so many people depending on it for their livelihood.
Let's move on to a particular LA problem, which is homelessness. Obviously, it's a problem all over the country, but especially here. And with the slowdown, I personally have been seeing more tents in more places. What's the recognition of homelessness at the federal level?
Well, I think at the federal level, we all understand what a tremendous challenge and epidemic homelessness is, and was, of course, before the pandemic. It has reached just extraordinary levels in so many cities, and here in LA, we are very much the epicenter of homelessness. So there's been an effort to collaborate at the federal, state, and local level. In the legislation we just passed, we added $11 billion more to try to help the homeless situation on top of what we had passed earlier in the CARES Act. We provide $100 billion for rental assistance so that we don't add to the rolls of the homeless right now. But this is a challenge in so many respects. I was on a Zoom call like this this morning with Mayor Garcetti, and among the issues we discussed were efforts here in LA to address the homelessness crisis. And, as challenging as it is to move people into hotels and motels and other joint housing facilities, it's not a simple matter as simply finding a room. You need to make sure that people can get food in that room. You need to make sure that they can get the services that they may need, whatever kind of service they need. And the wraparound services, the people power services, are as much of a challenge as finding the room as well. So the federal government predominantly has been helping through money and tax incentives because so much of this work of necessity is done at the local level. Prior to the pandemic, I introduced a bill, for example, to create favorable tax status so that if you're a property owner and you are selling your property, if you sell it to a nonprofit that provides low-income housing, or you sell it to a city's public housing agency, you can get the same treatment you would, favorable treatment, as if your property had been condemned. So that, the cities and nonprofits can compete with, sometimes foreign investors or real estate holding companies. We want to make sure that there's an opportunity for these agencies to acquire the housing and keep it affordable for people.
Another question from a reader, and this was something I had not really thought about. It's related to the flyovers of the U.S. Air Force Thunderbirds we've been having in Southern California, we had last Friday, which was just to honor the frontline workers battling the pandemic. And the reader says, quote, "I understand the flyovers are meant to be in honor of the hospital workers working with COVID-19 patients, but why are we not doing anything as a nation to honor those who have died of COVID-19? This is a disgrace." Is there any thought on that, of sort of ways, because I know we also have the thing we do every night at 8 o'clock of applauding the shift change of the health workers. What of recognition of those who've died, recognition of other people who are still working in the food industry, who are also highly necessary?
Yeah. Well, I think that's exactly right. I mean, all of these folks who've been touched by this virus or are risking their lives ought to be recognized right now. And we can become numb to the statistics and the numbers. We're now, I think, approaching or have exceeded 90,000 Americans who have lost their lives. It's hard to wrap your head around a number like that just keeps growing so constantly. And remember that these are parents and grandparents, brothers and sisters that are being lost, and families that are being so traumatized. So I think we do need to recognize those that have been suffering through this, and those that have been lost, even while we recognize, those everyday heroes who are driving the buses right now and taking a risk by driving the buses, or working in our grocery stores, delivering packages to our homes, as well as those working in the hospitals. Now, one thing I do want to mention related to this question is I've introduced a bill to establish a 9/11-like commission to do a whole of government analysis of why our country was so ill prepared for this pandemic, what's gone wrong in the early handling of this pandemic that's resulted in America leading the world in the number of infected and the number of people who have died. It didn't need to be this way. That's one thing I always try to underscore. It did not need to be this way, and it doesn't have to be this way going into the future. But I do think we need, while we're focused on our oversight in real time, we also need an after the fact analysis of what went wrong and how to better protect the country in the future. And that effort, much like the original 9/11 Commission, will be driven by the victims and their families. They will be necessary to overcome the opposition in Congress to doing this kind of an accounting. Now, the bill I introduced wouldn't take effect until next year, so I don't want this to be a political football in the election. But we really need good objective analysis. It ought to be done by people not in elective office, but by professionals, healthcare experts, and others, so that we can better protect the country in the future. And if we're going to be successful in that, like 9/11, where there was real resistance then by the then Bush administration, that resistance was overcome because of the families of the lost. And here, those families are going to be necessary to call for this kind of an accounting.
Well, actually, speaking of putting pressure, my next question is that, given what you see generally at the federal level, what can people here locally do to affect actions in Washington, given that we're not a swing state? We're a left-leaning part of a left-leaning state, and our left-leaning views are not a surprise to anybody. So how can we have an effect beyond the regular voting?
There are some great organizations doing amazing work that empower people here in California to influence policy nationwide. And this is a question that I would often get pre-pandemic. What can I do? I'm in a blue state. I'm very interested in the environment. But it's representatives from other places that are not doing what they should. How do I influence them? And the reality is that, a senator from some other state isn't going to be particularly concerned about what a constituent here thinks. But what some of the organizations have done, and I always use the same example because I thought it was so brilliant, the LGBT Center here in Los Angeles. During the midterms when the Affordable Care Act was in danger, and sadly that danger continues, and there was a desire to reach out to these swing staters and impress them, these swing state senators, and impress them as to why it was so important to preserve access to health care. What the LGBT Center did is they identified, for example, supporters in Alaska, and they would call the individuals in Alaska and ask them to call their Senator Lisa Murkowski. So that Senator Murkowski was getting calls from her own constituents. But it was a way that people here could help by reaching out people to urge them to contact their own representatives. So whether it's the environment or it's this pandemic or it's the issue of homelessness, weighing in whatever form you can, in Zoom conferences and letters to the editor, by emailing your representatives, by working through associations to move others around the country. They're just great ways to get involved, and we really need people to do that. Just one other thought on the subject. Earlier in the day, I had the opportunity to deliver food with Project Angel Food. And they're doing a tremendous job. And there are lots of opportunities like that right now in our community for people to help. And so even as we think globally, let's act locally. And they'll find good, safe ways with masks and gloves and social distancing that you can help meet some of the needs that are out there right now. And it's a great way to be involved.
So you're making a few personal appearances in the area. I think you've been, so I'm looking at your schedule here. You've been out a lot today already. Where can people see you in the next day or two?
Well, I'll be going to a couple of the hospitals in our district. I have been sort of working my way through the district and buying lunch for the healthcare workers at some of our local hospitals. I was in touch with a company that was able to acquire masks, and we're going to help deliver some of the masks to another hospital today. I don't know that I can encourage people to come out and visit with me right now. I wish I could. I have to maintain my distance when I'm delivering these meals or delivering masks or food to hospitals. Mostly where my constituents are seeing me is in forums like this. We've been doing telephone town halls with AARP. I did a class town hall with Immaculate Heart today, and have done town halls at Pasadena City College and Glendale Community College and LACC. So I've been spending a lot of my time with my constituents in virtual form, but it's nice also to get out in the community and get a chance to spend some time at a distance with them as well.
One last thing, Wikipedia also tells me you run marathons. Are you able to keep up your training under the circumstances?
No, and I do more triathlons than marathons, and there's nowhere for me to do any swim training, and I don't know that I'm in the shape anyway. I've got a separated shoulder. Ooh. But I am trying to get out, going a lot of walks, hike when I'm permitted to in places I can, and trying to get my cardio that way. And I also sequestered my son's old weightlifting set. So I've created a little gym at home and doing the best I can.
All right, as do we all. Well, Congressman Schiff, thank you very much for talking with us today.
A great pleasure. Thank you, Barry.